Hello everyone, this is Rozan and welcome to my podcast, which is actually a part of my course assessment for my class Language Diversity. Today we're going to talk about Identical Field by Penelope Eckert and some more social linguists and how they gave a perspective on how language, the way we speak and how we speak it, shapes our identities. Like from the way we say hello to the words we choose in specific situations, and how language is constantly at work in constructing who we are and how others see us. So let's get started. So today I'm going to talk about some really cool stuff. We'll explore Penelope Eckert's concept of the identical field, and to be honest, it's just a fancy way of saying that how we talk reveals a lot about who we are. But don't worry, we're also going to weave in some grave insights from William Labov, Judith Butler, Pierre Bourdieu, and Joshua Fishman, and a few others to really unpack what language diversity means in the 21st century. Okay, but first, let's talk about why this matters. We often think of language as just a tool for communication, right? Like I speak, you understand, mission accomplished. But I think it's so much more complex than that. Every word we choose, like every pronunciation or even every pause in a sentence, it's all part of this larger social dance we are doing. And this dance is especially interesting when we talk about language diversity, because it is not just about speaking different languages. It's about how even within a single language, variations can tell us so much about who we are, where we come from, and who we want to be. Now, let's kick things off with Penelope Eckert. She's a social linguist who really challenged the way we think about language variation. Eckert came up with this idea called the indexical field. Now, before you think, oh no, what is it? Let me break it down. Basically, she's saying that the way we speak, our accent, our words of choice, and our tone of voice, it acts like a signal that gives people clues about our social identity. Are we from the city or the countryside, or are we teenagers, professionals, or somewhere in between? Well, here's where it gets cool. Imagine you're in a job interview, and you say something like, I'm really excited to work on this project. But maybe outside of that interview, when you're hanging out with friends, you would say, yo, I'm stoked for this. Same message, but the way you deliver it is different depending on who you are with, right? That's the identical feel at work. It's a subtle but powerful way we adjust our language to fit the social context. And I think we do this all the time, probably without even realizing it. And now if you see, or if you just think, what does this actually mean for everyday lives? Well, I would say it means that language is a part of how we perform our identities. And speaking of performance, this brings up so much to my head. I would rather talk about Judith Butler here now. She's not a linguist, but a philosopher, and she's famous for her theory of performativity, especially around gender. Butler actually argues that identity is not something we are, but something we do. It's like a set of actions, behaviors, and yes, even language that we perform in order to be something. Whether that's female, professional, or casual, or male. And this idea of performance, it ties so perfectly into indexical field. We are like constantly performing different versions of ourselves through our language to portray different social contexts. But here's something I want us to think about. If we're always adjusting our language to fit different situations, does that mean we're never really showing our true selves? Or is it more that our true self is just multiple? If we think, I think this is where Butler's idea gets really interesting. She suggests that there is no single authentic self waiting to be uncovered. Instead, we are fluid, shifting and adapting, and language is one of the main ways to do that. Just like how she says in her theory, that gender is not something that we are like we are, but we are rather something about to be, in order to be. And now, if I switch the gear a bit and bring William Labov into the mix, Labov is a giant in the world of social linguistics. Like back in the 1960s, he did these studies in New York City, looking at how people's language changed based on their social class. And his most famous work showed that upper-class New Yorkers were more likely to pronounce the R words like ka and flo, whereas working-class people would drop the R. So you would get something more like ka or fla. What's fascinating about Labov's work, I think, is that he was not just studying accents for the sake of it. He was showing how language is a marker of social status. And this is where things get interesting. In terms of power, if you've ever been in a situation where you felt judged because of the way you speak, whether it's your accent or your vocabulary, or maybe even the pronunciation of certain words, you're tapping into what Labov was exploring. Like, language is never just neutral, and it's always charged with social meaning. And this is where we bring in someone like Pierre Bourdieu. He argued that language is a kind of a capital, a resource that you can use to gain power in certain social settings. This is going to get really interesting now if we talk about Pierre Bourdieu, because this is a really interesting perspective he gave out. But there's a tricky part. If you think, because he means that it's a linguistic capital. Now, if you think if language is a form of capital, that means not everyone has equal access to it. Think about it. If you grow up speaking a non-standard dialect, or if English is not your first language, you might be at like a disadvantage in formal settings like school or work. So is language diversity something to celebrate? Or does it reinforce social inequalities? What would you think? I think it's, like, in my perspective, it's both, honestly. Like, if you see, the beauty of language diversity is that it shows how rich and adaptable human communications can be, right? But at the same time, it can also create barriers for people who don't have access to the right kind of linguistic capital. That's, my folks, linguistic capital for you. Now, if I move to Joshua Fishman, he's a social linguist who made significant contributions to our understanding of language and its role in cultural identity. Fishman was especially, I think, interested in language preservation, particularly how minority languages could survive in a world dominated by major languages like English, Spanish, Mandarin, and his work stressed the importance of language in maintaining cultural identity. And he studied how communities could actively work to keep their language alive, even under pressure from global languages. But if I give a critical insight here, Fishman's work raises a critical point about power dynamics involved in language preservation. Like, if you see, while code switching allows speakers to navigate multiple linguistic words, it's also highlighting the pressure placed on minority language speakers to conform to dominant languages. This is not just a cultural or linguistic issue, but I think it's deeply political. When speakers of minority languages switch to dominant ones for survival in education or the workplace, it begs the question, is this a sign of a linguistic flexibility, or is it a form of erasure? Like, the preservation of endangered languages becomes a resistance against the force of globalization, but it's also a constant struggle against the overwhelming pressure to assimilate linguistically. And this complexity makes us reconsider the role of language in both maintaining and eroding cultural identity. Let's throw another example into the mix here. That's maybe more relevant to us today, I think. Think about internet culture. We all know about it, right? You've got memes, you've got slangs, you've got abbreviations, entire forms of communication that exist almost exclusively online. And language in these spaces evolve super fast. One day, everyone's saying lit, and the next day, it's out of style. It's replaced by something like bet or slay. It's a perfect example of how language is not just about words, but more about signaling group membership. If you don't keep up with the latest slang, you might feel a bit lost in certain online communities, I think. But here's something else also to think about. I've had so many thoughts about this. So if you think about it like this, is internet slang its own kind of linguistic capital? What do you think? I would say yes, in my opinion. If you see, knowing how to navigate these linguistic spaces, it can give you social power, especially among younger generations. At the same time, through it can create exclusion for those who aren't as fluent in internet speak. It's like Lebow's New York study all over again, but instead of R pronunciation, we are talking about emojis and memes. I think more or less that's what I think about it. But I also want to talk about code switching. This is something I spoke about earlier a bit, like I think 1 or 2 minutes. If you talk about code switching, it is when someone switches between different languages or dialects depending on the situation. You see this, I think, a lot in multilingual communities, but it also happens when someone uses formal language at work and then switches to a more casual style with friends. Like, code switching is an amazing example of how language is flexible and how we are always navigating different social worlds through the words we choose. But here's the thing. Code switching also highlights power dynamics. Why do we feel the need to switch at all? In some cases, I think it's about survival, but people may switch to the dominant language or dialect to avoid being judged or marginalized. Like, take an example. Let's think about this one example I've thought about. Take a college student, and for example, who speaks in certain way with friends, but adjusts their speech in like a classroom setting. This is not about just sounding more proper, it's about fitting into the social norm of different spaces. But it also raises the question, why should anyone have to change the way they speak to be taken seriously? This is where we circle back to be. I think this is where we circle back to Baudrillard's idea of linguistic capital, and the way you speak can either open doors or close them depending on who's listening. And this is why language diversity is such a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's this incredible expression of identity. It's how we show the world who we are and where we come from. And on the other hand, certain ways of speaking are privileged over others, and that creates inequalities. It's a tension we can't ignore, but it also one that invites us to think more deeply about it, how we value different kind of languages and expression. But before we wrap things up, I want to bring in one last perspective here. Erving Goffman, I'm not sure if I pronounced his name right, I'm really sorry. He was a sociologist who talked a lot about this term face, which is basically how we present ourselves to others. And he argued that we are always managing our face in social interactions, trying to present the best version of ourselves depending on who we are with. And when you think about it, language is one of the main ways we manage our face, whether we are trying to sound smart in an academic setting or just trying to fit in with a group of friends. We are constantly adjusting our language to fit the moment. So, to bring it all together, language is not just a means of communication. It's a powerful tool that shapes our identities and reflects social hierarchies, if you see. And the way we speak reveals our backgrounds or even our social context, even our aspirations. As we navigate the complex terrain of language diversity, let's remember that every variation in our piece of our identity, it's a piece of identity, multi-faced and worth celebrating. Thank you for joining me today on this linguistic journey, and I hope you liked it. And if you're a nerd like me in linguistics, maybe you should really check out work of Willem Labov, Penelope Eckert, and one of my favorite, Judith Butler. I hope you really liked all of this. Thank you so much.